Welcome to A Green Future, Race, Gender, Environment with advisors Dr. Heidi Huttner and Dennis Yeri. Tonight is the second of 5 weekly Tuesday webinars, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Mark Z. Jacobson as our special guest. My name is Dan Schneider, and I'm the Executive Director of the Florence Belsky Charitable Foundation, also known as flobel.org. And our mission is to connect people so they could share information and empower each generation to teach the others. Our major asset is our 1,000 plus advisory board of global advisors who are experts in their fields. Tonight's co-hosts, Dr. Heidi Huttner and Dennis Yeri, are two of those experts, and we appreciate their help. We'll be recording the webinar so it could be available on demand in the future. It's also being live streamed, I'm told. And recordings from last week's webinar with Dr. Michael Mann and our past webinars are now online on our website as a resource for lifelong learning. And now I'd like to introduce our Associate Director, Rivka Rivera, who will give a couple of housekeeping rules to keep the webinar orderly. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rivka, for all your help.
Thank you, Dan. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back if you were at our webinar last week. And thank you so much for joining us. I'll keep this short and sweet. There's not much that you need to know other than we are going to have a Q&A towards the end. So please, you can even start throwing questions in there now. We will definitely be getting to those. And you gave us some great questions last week, and you can throw them in throughout the series. But I'm just going to introduce you to our wonderful co-hosts. We have Dr. Heidi Huttner, who's an associate professor at Stony Brook University. She writes about environmental issues, and currently she's working on a documentary, Accidents Can Happen, The Women of 3 Mile Island, as well as a companion book of the same name. Her writing appears in the New York Times, Ms. Mag, Long Reads, PRI, Aeon, Yes, Dame, and others. She has books and chapters in books with Oxford, UP, UVA, and more. She hosts the webisode Coffee with H2, a sustainability interview series. And don't miss her TEDx, Ecofeminism and Eco Grief. And another co-host, Dennis Yeri, is an Iroquois musician, composer, and environmentalist. For many years, he was the director of Native Day Thanksgiving at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. And he's worked on many projects in film, television, and theater. He's currently the musical director of Unto These Hills in Cherokee, North Carolina, as it has continued to use his music as a conduit to aid Native American and environmental issues. So I'll hand this over to Heidi and Dennis.
Thank you so much, Rivka, and thank you, Dan. We're just grateful to have this opportunity to talk about these issues right now. It's an urgent time period, and climate change and environmental issues remain hugely problematic. So even though we're in this time of COVID, it's just really great that we can do this live and talk with such an incredible expert as Mark Jacobson, who I'm honored to introduce. He is a climate solutions expert. He's a Stanford University professor. He is the Stanford Woods professor. His work is focused on the better understanding of air pollution and global warming problems and developing large-scale, clean, renewable energy solutions to them. To that end, he has developed and applied three-dimensional atmosphere, biosphere, ocean computer models and solvers to simulate air pollution, weather, climate, and renewable energy. He's also developed roadmaps to transition states and countries to 100% clean, renewable energy for all purposes, and computer models to examine grid stability in the presence of high penetrations of renewable energy. Mark also is really great about getting into the public, talking to people. Sometimes scientists hide away in their labs. Mark certainly doesn't do that. He's been in documentaries. He's going to be in my documentary. He's been in Josh Fox documentaries. He's been on David Letterman. And I think he's just a really wonderful model of communicating science to the general public. So thank you so much, Mark, for joining us.
Well, thanks, Heidi, for having me on your program.
Great. So one of the things we talked about when I interviewed you for Accidents Can Happen was, and I found fascinating, was how you got into doing this work. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a little background about what led you to want to work on pollution issues.
Well, it all started when I was very young, about 11, 12, 13 years old. I used to play tennis, and I would travel to Los Angeles and San Diego, where it was very polluted back then. I mean, Los Angeles is still the most polluted city in the United States today, but back then it was even much more polluted. And I just realized the air was just so bad, and I had trouble breathing just playing tennis in it, that I thought, why should people live like this? And I felt kind of then and there that this is a problem that when I grew up, I wanted to look at and try to understand better and solve. And kind of as I grew older, I kind of honed that idea to try to understand and solve large scale air pollution and also climate problems, which were starting to become apparent at the time. So my first step was to try to understand them. So I spent, well, since 1990, building computer models to simulate climate and air pollution. And then in the last 20 years, also looking at energy solutions to those problems. So yeah, it's been a kind of a whole procedure of trying to understand the problems in detail, and then to try to develop solutions based on the understanding of the problems. And that's why I think it's my path is a little bit different than some people who will focus just on the problems or just on the solutions. Since my goal has always been to try to solve the problems, but to understand them first.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Because a lot of times, people do talk about that. Go to an environmental conference and you'll hear about all the problems, but then you won't walk away with a toolkit about what we can do about it. And that's what seems so important about what you're doing. You're really offering viable solutions and workable solutions. So I wanted to just ask you if you could talk about, before we get to solutions, because you have them, and we really want to break them down and hear from you what they are, but if you could talk about where we are right now in this moment, in this COVID moment, with climate change and what's happening, so people can get a better understanding of where we are right now in this time.
Well, I mean, climate change problems to date are really the integral or the summation of all the increase of greenhouse gases that have occurred in the past, as well as particles. I mean, particles in the air, which you can see, you can't see gases, but you can see particles. Dark particles are responsible for about 20% of all global warming and greenhouse gases for most of it, and mostly carbon dioxide of those greenhouse gases. But it's an accumulation. And right now since the early 1900s, we're about 1.1 degrees Celsius global average above that. But in places like the Arctic, you see temperature differences of about 4 or 5 degrees on average, whereas at lower latitudes, it's a little lower than 1 degree. But on average, it's about 1.1 degree. And we're concerned about getting to 1.5 degrees global warming above, not pre-industrial, but early 1900s even. And that would cause even greater damage. Right now, lots of damage is occurring. You can see it through enhanced wildfires, through enhanced supercharged hurricanes, more famine and heat stroke and heat stress in places already hot, greater air pollution. Air pollution actually gets worse in places that are already polluted when temperatures get higher. And then you have sea level rise that's causing coastal flooding in a lot of places. The carbon dioxide in the air dissolves in the ocean and acidifies the ocean and destroys coral reefs. There are a lot of impacts that are occurring right now. And there has been, during COVID, the last few months, there's been a drop in emissions. But because, for example, carbon dioxide has such a long lifetime in the air, it doesn't result in a drop in the CO2 levels over a 3-month period. It just slows their rise. But there has been a drop in air pollution. There are worldwide 7 million people die every year from air pollution. And one of the benefits of stopping air pollution instantaneously or stopping emissions instantaneously, is that it has an immediate impact on human health and immediate benefit on human health. So there has been, due to this drop in emissions, it's been estimated, depending on where you are, between 15 and 30% over the last 3 months. That can easily translate into a 15 to 30% reduction in air pollution mortality and morbidity in those locations where air pollution is bad. And in the United States, we have about 78,000 deaths from air pollution every year. But in Asia, like in China, there's over 1 million deaths per year. In India, same thing. And there you have a big benefit from even the short-term drop in air pollution levels. So there's not really a benefit in terms of global warming of this short-term reduction of air pollution, but there is a big benefit in terms of health. But we really need to solve both problems simultaneously: air pollution, health problems, and climate problems. And to do that, you really need to eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions and all air pollutant emissions. which include particle emissions that affect warming as well. So that's where we get to the energy solutions.
So Mark, I would like to ask you about, I guess a lot of people, myself included, are concerned about what's going to happen. You know, the COVID has kind of like brought things to a halt in some way. On NPR today, I heard a story about how the whales are singing differently because they can hear each other now because the cruise ships are not all out on the water. And I guess the biggest concern we have is like what's going to happen. What are you maybe personally learning from this little break that we're having, even though you said it's not that enough, you know, a great difference. But can you look at this opportunity as an opportunity to study something with everything shut down? And also, how do you see things coming out of this?
Well, yes, definitely. If I were like looking at this from a computer modeling perspective, it's like a bonanza because it's like a perfect test case to test your model against. However, the results are pretty obvious to me because after having looked at this for so long, you know that if you're going to reduce energy use, you're going to reduce emissions from energy use. And this will result in a very immediate benefit to health and to air quality and to visibility. And this is what we've seen. So we didn't, you know, it's not really necessary to study this in detail to know the answer, you know, unless you know, certainly getting the exact numbers, or not exact, but a kind of more precise estimate of the numbers in terms of health benefits, you can do study for. But it does really prove the point that if we do change our energy infrastructure, we will get an immediate benefit, even if you don't believe in climate change. Even if you don't believe emissions are causing global warming, you can see this immediate benefit in terms of visibility, in terms of health, in terms of reduced asthma, respiratory illness, pneumonia, you know, some bacterial infections, bronchitis, emphysema, even lung cancers. You're going to see these benefits in terms of health that, and so you know that if we do transition the entire energy infrastructure, there's only more benefits to come. And that's, I think, the biggest thing is really to illustrate to people that, you know, you don't have to solve this problem necessarily for climate. If you're a climate non-believer in climate change, you don't have to believe in it. You can still believe in the solution, which is renewable energy transition, and you will then see benefits in terms of not only health and visibility, but there are other peripheral benefits that you will see, including lower costs, including more jobs that are created. And so these are, in fact, that's, you know, one of the nice things about renewable energy is there are so many benefits of it that you don't really have to believe in climate change to believe in the transition to renewable energy.
So could you lay out for us, I know it's a big plan, but could you give us a sketch of what the Solutions Project really is? So there is a project that you've worked on, I know, with a group, and it's called the Solutions Project, but it comes out of really your study and your research. So could you just lay it out for us?
Yeah, I'll give a brief history. So in 2011, I had a meeting and I met Mark Ruffalo, Josh Fox, Marco Krapels, who, well, Mark Ruffalo is an actor, but also an activist and entertainer. And Josh Fox is a documentarian who did the movies Gasland and Gasland 2. And Marco Krapels is a businessman who's now has a battery startup company and formerly worked at Tesla and Solar City. And we kind of got together and we're looking at how to try to address natural gas hydrofracking in New York. And I was asked to develop maybe a plan or a sketch of a plan for New York to transition the energy to clean renewable energy, because Mark DeLucchi is a doctor at UC Berkeley, but also used to work at Davis, now also still works at Davis. And we came up with a worldwide plan in 2009 to transition the entire world to clean renewable wind, water, and solar power, just to see if it's feasible. And we concluded, yes, it's technically and economically possible. There are social and political barriers. So, you know, we hoped that it would, well, we first postulated whether we could solve the problem by 2030. And the answer was, yes, technically it's possible to solve the problem by 2030. Remember, this is back in 2009. But for social and political reasons, more likely, a full solution to the problem worldwide wouldn't occur until maybe 2050. We subsequently postulated that we should try to get 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. It turned out, I didn't realize it at the time, that this 100% by 2030 turned out to be the reason that the Green New Deal is based on 2030 was that paper back in 2009. And Green New Deal being where the US would transition its entire energy infrastructure to clean renewable energy by 2030. And again, we think it's still technically and economically possible to do that if that's what the whole country decided. We all got on board, but for practical purposes, some sectors might get transitioned by 2030, but others probably later. But anyway, we got together and we really bonded, and I ended up developing an energy plan for New York State with other people, including Bob Howarth and Tony Graffia at Cornell and Janet Barth and others. And we developed this plan, but then we got this group of community leaders and actors and environmentalists and nonprofits behind us and business people behind us to kind of get this information out about this New York energy plan. And we then started this nonprofit called the Solutions Project, which is still a nonprofit, thesolutionsproject.org. And with this Solutions Project, that really helped to catapult this energy plan for New York to the policy level. And eventually we got it out to the governor's office in New York. And eventually the governor got a law passed to go 50% renewables. And then that got converted to 100% effectively just last year. So New York now has a goal to go to 100% renewables and zero carbon by 2045. And that was the original origin of that law was this New York energy plan. But it wasn't just me. I mean, I did the science along with some other scientists and students, but it was just this whole coalition of people behind it, including actors and community leaders and activists and business people. And well, anyway, the Solutions Project kept pushing forward. We developed a plan for California, got that into law, eventually into SB 100, or even before that, Governor Brown passed a 50% renewables law. But it was only a month after we met with the governor's office with our California energy paper. And we developed eventually 50 plans for 50 states. And subsequently, as of this year, there are 14 states and territories in the US that have 100% renewable or effectively renewable laws on the books or executive orders. And there are also 160 odd cities in the US that have passed such laws to go to 100% renewables. And worldwide, there are over around 300 cities and now 250 or some odd international companies that have mandates to go to 100% renewables. And this really, a lot of these plans, and just the idea of going to 100% renewables came from this original science that we started in 2009. But it was really this coalition of groups that combined into the Solutions Project nonprofit, but also they actually gathered 100 other nonprofits to form a 100% alliance to go to 100% renewables. And it's just all these nonprofits working together really got this legislation passed across the US and also now around the world. There's lots of laws that have gone up. So anyway, the Solutions Project still exists. It's transitions its focus to go into inner city communities and to try to help. It's really the goal is to help 100% of the people to go to 100% renewable energy. So it's trying to go into diverse communities and get support and to educate the public still about the possibilities of going to renewable energy.
Can you be a little specific about what you mean by renewable? Because I know there's an issue with some people call nuclear power renewables. Some people think it's not. But if you could just lay out what is like physically what's in your plan.
Yeah, so we really define our options as clean renewable energy, so clean, renewable energy. So that includes wind power, onshore and offshore wind, solar power, that's solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, concentrated solar power, solar thermal for heat, and also water power, which means hydroelectric, geothermal, tidal power, wave power, So we do not include biomass. We do not include burning of any fuels, even hydrogen, which would have to be produced from wind and water or solar power from electricity, and then used in a fuel cell, so not burned. So no biomass, no biofuels, no bioenergy, no nuclear power, no carbon capture, no coal with carbon capture, no gas with carbon capture, no geoengineering. It's really things that we know work and that actually reduce air pollution simultaneously as reducing greenhouse gases, and so that's why we don't have combustion, because if you burn things, you might reduce greenhouse gases, even if it's, let's say it's a biofuel. Some argue that you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and others argue, no, you don't. But let's say you do, but you're still producing air pollution because you're burning the fuel. And in terms of nuclear power, the other thing is we're trying to provide energy security. And with nuclear power, well, first of all, it's really impractical today to put up any new nuclear power that's either cost effective or doesn't take over a decade to install and plan and install. I mean, right, the planning to operation time of a nuclear plant is 10 to 19 years, with some of them right now are taking closer to 20 years. And it's just too long. We need to solve 80% of the problem in 10 years. And you can't have a technology that takes more than 10 years to actually be implemented if you start planning it today. So it's just a non-starter. Plus it costs like 4 to 5 times per unit energy that of new wind or new solar. So on the cost ground, it doesn't work. But then there's waste issues. There's the risk of meltdown. 1.5% of all nuclear reactors ever built have melted down to some degree. There's weapons proliferation risk. Several countries have developed weapons secretly under the guise of civilian nuclear energy programs. Then there's mining risk. 10% of all miners, that underground miners for uranium, have died of lung cancer. And that's because when you have uranium mining, you have radon, and radon decays to polonium, which is a carcinogen that miners breathe in, and sure enough, they die. So there's so many risks associated with nuclear power. There's no reason we need it. And so it's really an opportunity cost. If you think of spending, if you have $1 to spend, why would you spend it on something that costs 5 times more, takes over a decade longer than to put up wind or solar, and then also has all these host of other risks when you can put something that's clean, renewable, and much safer, and that's better for society overall.
So, Mark, I'm wondering how, I think about a lot of Native American reservations in the country. I think a lot of low-income communities. I think of people of color, and how it seems disproportionate the way that the pollution has been cast upon them, I guess you could say, how they end up being like the waste dump sometimes. And I'm just wondering, do you see a way that they can buy into these plans? There's a way that they can be part of these solutions, and how can they be part of the solution? And I was wondering, how widespread does this solution have to be? I mean, if California is obviously a huge state, but in New York State, I mean, how many windmills do we need? Can a Native American reservation just do this of their own accord, just for themselves? And how much is needed to in your opinion, how much do we need to do, I guess, is the question.
Right. Well, first of all, because take the minority communities are receiving the brunt of the problem, if we actually transition our energy, they're actually going to get the greatest benefit. So one of the reasons that I hope these communities are interested in transitioning is because they will get the best benefit in terms of health, in particular, of transitioning. But there's also a lot of jobs to be had as well. And so this is really, there's no downside to transitioning for any community, but you will see a greater benefit to those who are suffering the most already. And in terms of numbers, well, if we look at the entire United States, so we've done calculations, we've done plans to transition 143 countries, including the US. And if I focus on the US for a minute, the capital cost of transitioning the entire United States for all purposes to entirely clean renewable energy, this is in all sectors. So that's electricity, transportation, building, heating and cooling, industry, agriculture, forestry, fishing, the military. Transitioning everything and having it being powered by just wind and water and solar. So that means electrifying everything. So no more gas in buildings, no more natural gas in homes or businesses, just electric heat pumps, using electric cars, some hydrogen fuel cell vehicles for heavy long distance transport, electrifying industry. It would cost about, we calculate about $7.8 trillion is the upfront capital cost. And today, Joe Biden, who's running for president, he announced a plan to spend in 4 years $2 trillion just on this project, just to transition the United States to clean renewable energy. So I was pleasantly shocked to see that, because if in 4 years he spends $2 trillion on this, that's 1/4 of the entire transition we'll need in 4 years for everything. And that's a really good step. Whether it actually happens or not is a different question, but at least that goal is a good goal. But so in terms of the numbers of turbines, it all depends on their, like wind turbines. Well, for the US, we'd proposed around, it's going to be around 55% solar, maybe 45% wind. And these numbers can shift because you can mix more solar, less solar, more wind, less wind. It's on the order of 4 or 5% hydroelectric, and then the rest is going to be a combination of geothermal and small amounts of tidal and wave power. And that, so each community, in fact, we have done plans for not only the US as a whole, but also all 50 states and 53 towns and cities in the United States. And so we'd have to look at each plan to kind of get an idea of the numbers of devices that we need, but it's all feasible. In terms of the land areas, the overall package would take less than 1% of the United States land area. And keep in mind, 1.3% of the US land area today is consumed by the fossil fuel industry. There are on the order of 1.7 million active oil and gas wells in the US. There are 2.3 million inactive ones. There are millions of miles of pipelines. There are there are oil refineries, there are gas storage facilities, there are over 100,000 gas stations, and there's all sorts of fossil fuel infrastructure, the coal mines that take up 1.3% of the US land area. So if we transition everything, we're actually reducing the land requirements. And that land area includes spacing between wind turbines and the space needed for new solar panels in utility scale power plants. And even in this case of the less than 1% land used for wind, water, and solar, more than half of that is space between wind turbines that can be used for multiple purposes, including putting solar on that land. So it's less land area, but it's also a relatively constant amount of land area over a long period of time, whereas every year we add 50,000 new oil and gas wells to the US. Every year, 50,000 new wells are drilled in the United States, and this is destroying the country, just pockmarking it with this destructive industry. And you can do flyovers like North Dakota, all you see is these pockmarks of, used to be pristine land, now it's just a bunch of oil and gas holes. And so there's this benefit that you'll see in communities, and the most benefit, though, as I mentioned, will be in terms of health benefits and job creation and the cost of energy. Because electricity is so much more efficient than combustion. Like an electric car uses 1/4 to 1/5 the energy as a gasoline car. And so you basically use much less energy. And same with heat pumps in homes. It's like 1/4 the energy as a gas heater if you use a heat pump for air and water heating and air conditioning. And that results, the fact that you use much less energy means your actual costs, your bills are lower. And so you're using on the order of 57% less energy due to just the efficiency of electricity or combustion. Then there's another 10% benefit in terms of the cost per unit energy. So it's on the order of 60% lower annual costs for everybody if they switch to renewable energy. And most people don't realize this. So there's this additional benefit of energy costs are lower, 60%. And then there's less health costs and less climate costs. And so the overall, what we call social cost, which is energy plus health plus climate cost is 90% less with a clean renewable energy system. So you have a 90% less social cost with renewables. You have 60% less energy costs. You have fewer deaths and hospitalizations, fewer lost work days. You have more jobs and use less land. So there's just, it's a win-win for everybody.
Those are remarkable numbers, and it's really shocking that that information is not more widely available.
Yeah, well, it's hard to get information. One of the challenges I found in this, working on this for so long, is that it's really difficult to get information out to large numbers of people. And that's, we've tried in different ways, and we've been somewhat successful to get it to more people, but still there are 7.5 billion people on the earth. And how do you get basic numbers like this out to so many people so they can make better decisions? And especially policymakers too.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Dennis.
Well, I was just going to ask because I think Heidi mentioned in the beginning that you had written a book, and I was wondering if the book lays out some of these things like as kind of like a guide map or something. Maybe you can speak about that for us.
Yeah, so yeah, the fact that the book has all these numbers in it, and it describes, so it's really written because I'm teaching a class that I started not this last year, but the year before. And the class is titled the same thing, 100% clean renewable energy and storage for everything. And it is an online class, although I'm trying to get it so Stanford doesn't charge for it, which they may be able to do next year. But anyway, the book is really about laying out what are the technologies, or what's the problems. First, I'm trying to understand the problem a little bit, but then expanding on what are the technologies in terms of the energy technologies, in terms of the storage technologies. And it talks about transmission distribution. It talks about basics of electricity. It also talks about, then it goes into detail of solar photovoltaics and wind turbines and solar energy and wind energy in general. And then it looks at energy plans, how to develop an energy plan for a region or a state or a city or a country. And it looks at trying to keep the grid stable, what's necessary to keep the grid stable. And then it looks at the history of kind of the transitioning to 100% renewables and what has been done so far. What are some of the policies needed? What do we need to do going forward? So that's kind of a summary of what's in the book. But it is kind of a handbook of 100% renewable energy and how to, as well as what's needed and what has been done.
So there's an interesting question here, which that one of our attendees is asking, but it's a question that people always ask, and of course I know that I would ask it on behalf of our audience. So when people say, well, if we're fully renewable, what happens when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing?
Yeah, so that's the major question. In fact, that's probably the number one question I get is, what happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't always shine? Well, first of all, we're looking at different energy sectors. So there's electricity, transportation, building, heating and cooling, and industry. I'll call those the four major ones. Mm-hmm. And so, really, it only matters if the sun's not shining in the electricity portion of the sector, but we are electrifying everything.
Right.
So everything's going to run on electricity. So let's say you have an electric car, and you don't necessarily need the sun to be shining when you're driving your car, right? Because your car is not plugged into, your car has a battery, so it's already storing electricity. So you can actually charge your car any time of day or night. So you can charge it when the sun is shining, and not charge it when, or charge it when the wind is blowing, which is often at night, or usually people will charge it when the electricity price is the lowest. So one of the techniques to actually address this problem is what's called demand response management, where utilities give people incentives not to use electricity at certain times of the day. Because you can either you can match power demand and supply either by controlling the supply, having enough supply when you need it, or controlling the demand for the energy. So if you don't have any supply, if you can reduce the demand, then you can match the demand with the supply. So by giving people incentive, like if they have a lower price of electricity at a certain time of day, then more people are going to shift their electricity consumption to that time of the day. They might not run their dryer or charge their car or something else, do the dishwashing
Now, I think that there's a lot of people who, like, I always hear this, how are we going to pay for all of this? I mean, I'm used to telling everyone, try to look, to the future, to the 7 generations, to look, and you can see the other end, and you could say this is all that we're going to save. But right now, people are wondering, this is, to switch everything over and to do all of this stuff. And how do we cover that part of it?
Well, it's actually cheaper to pay for it than it is to pay for the current infrastructure. I mean, by the energy costs worldwide today are on the order of per year, or about $12 trillion per year. If you just look up the cost of all energy being consumed and you just aggregate it over a year worldwide, it's on the order of around, maybe it was somewhere 10 to 12 trillion. By 2050, it's expected to be about $17.5 trillion per year is what everybody pays for energy. However, if we go to a clean renewable energy system, we're paying $6.8 trillion per year. So that's 60% less. That's the 60% less number basically comes in right there, is how much we pay per year. So we are paying more to maintain our current infrastructure than we will be paying for the new infrastructure. Worldwide, the transition everything to clean renewable energy is about $72 trillion per year. In the US, it was 7.8 trillion. But but that it will pay for itself. If you do this transition, it'll pay for itself very quickly within a few years. And you could do this even on your own home. Like Heidi mentioned, I built a home 3.5 years ago, and it has no gas, it's all electric, and there was an upfront cost. However, in every year I've had, well, since then, in 3 years, I've had no natural gas bill, no electric bill, and no gasoline bill for vehicles because I have electric cars. And also on top of that, I produced 20% more electricity than I used, and I sold that back to the grid. There's a community choice aggregation utility in my area called Silicon Valley Clean Energy, where they will pay basically whatever they would charge for the electricity at the time it's generated. And so in the last 3 years, on average, I've received an $800 check from them each year for the extra electricity. So if you add all that up, plus the savings of all the bills, the money back, and also there are tax incentives now. With the tax incentives, the payback time is 5 years. Without tax incentives, it's about 10 years. So, but the solar panels are warranted for 25 years. And so that means you're basically getting free energy after your payback time, or until the warranty expires, or even probably after that. And that really tells me, it's really proof that all these numbers that we're doing is true. You're going to save money doing this. Sure, there's an upfront cost for everything. Certainly there are financing mechanisms where some solar companies, for example, will lease solar on your roof so you don't really have to pay anything. You don't pay anything other than your normal energy bill. You're now paying it to them, and you're getting solar. Or you could get your electricity from one of these community choice aggregation utilities in certain states. So like that same utility, let's say I had no solar on my roof, I could actually buy electricity from them instead of PG&E, which is my normal utility, who doesn't have 100% renewables, but this community choice aggregation utility offers 100% renewable energy. So they buy a wind farm or power purchase agreement with wind farms and solar farms and hydro and geothermal, and they will procure 100% renewables and sell it to me at the same price as PG&E would sell their fossil energy to me. So if you can't afford the upfront cost of solar panels, that's another option, is to procure, just to go to a utility that's offering 100% renewables now. So that's a really attractive, especially if you're in an apartment where you can't even put solar on your roof. Anyway, there are lots of financing options. The costs are so low, and the cost benefits are so great. As I mentioned, in terms of health, the health cost savings alone wipe out any energy costs you have very quickly. And then there are climate cost benefits, and there are job benefits, as I mentioned.
So what's the path forward? I know that, AOC is, advocating for the Green New Deal, but we need more than one or two politicians to be supporting this. And it's got, we need a large scale policy. So, I mean, and obviously she's not the only one, but he seems to be the loudest voice advocating for it. What do you see in a practical way as the way forward to make this happen? It sounds like it makes total sense. It's economically viable. It's healthier for us. It's better for the planet. It's better, there's nothing you're saying that doesn't sound like there's a downside. So why aren't we moving forward, and how do we move forward?
Well, there has been a lot of movement, as I mentioned, in terms of states. There are 14 states and territories and District of Columbia that have passed 100% renewable electricity laws or executive orders. Now, that's only electric power. So we do need transportation, buildings. There are some communities that have outlawed gas in new homes, for example, Berkeley, Menlo Park, or two of the communities in California, but there are a few others sprinkled around the US. So we need that on a large scale. We can't have new gas in new buildings. We have to stop pipelines from being built. And there was some success on that the last couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. And we also need to transition industry. So this is partly the way to solve this. Is it's a combination of individual action. People can do things in their own home. The next car you drive should be an electric car, or not drive a car at all. And also, replace your heater with a heat pump, air source heat pump or ground source heat pump for air heating and water heating, and also air conditioning. Go to an electric induction cooktop stove instead of a gas stove. Basically, take out all gas in your home when you can, either when it breaks the current. system breaks down, or if you can't invest in a new system right now, do it, because otherwise you're just using gas, consuming it and burning it and producing, and there's emissions associated with the mining of the gas as well as the use of it. And then the second, so people can do a lot on their own, and also they can, can reduce energy use and telecommute more, as we're doing all right now probably. But also at the policy levels, the other level. So the policymakers have a big role to play, but it's both policy and individual action. And to the extent that you can get information to your policymakers and to get policymakers who are really on board with the transition, that's very useful. So in the United States, there are many states that are very friendly to transitioning to entirely renewable energy. And it's just a matter of time before more laws get put in place. But of course, there's a lot of stuff can be done piecemeally at the state and local level, and that's where most of the action has been in the last several years. But we do need federal level involvement to really do this at a large scale. For example, we need faster approval of offshore wind, because right now it's being held up, even though there's no reason.
Why is that being held up? I don't understand it.
Well, it's political. It's easy to describe motives with the current administration. I won't go there right now, but there are a lot of special interests who don't want offshore wind. There's certainly, every offshore wind farm you put up, that's one less natural gas plant that we need, or even nuclear plant. Mm-hmm. So there are certainly special interests trying to block some of this, as well as there are a lot of also individuals. Some people just there's NIMBYism, there's concern about views, although the new turbines, they're so far out there that you can't see them. And now they have floating turbines, so there really is no excuse, because floating turbines are way out of anybody's view. So anyway, it's right now, it's a political issue, and that's why it's being slowed.
And what do you say to people who talk about, well, we'll have to subsidize it? I mean, don't we have to subsidize nuclear? Don't we subsidize oil and gas?
All energy is subsidized. So it's really the level of subsidy. But there would be a natural transition entirely to clean renewable energy if we have enough time, but we don't have enough time. So in order to get this done quickly, that's why we need subsidy, because otherwise the transition would be way too slow. And so we do need faster action. So that's why we do need Jumpstart. But the system will pay for itself over time. So that money will come back. That money is an investment. That's how you should actually think of it, is an investment rather than a subsidy. Whereas with nuclear, it is definitely a subsidy, because it's basically you're paying 4 to 5 times more for the same amount of energy as with wind or solar. So you're basically dumping money into a big endless pit.
So, Mark, I have a question here from someone that I thought was pretty interesting. I want to know, how much progress has the U.S. made transitioning to clean energy the last few years, or I would say just overall, compared to other countries? So, do we have another place in the world that we can see as a role model for us that's ahead of us, or somebody we can look to that's been successful with some of this?
Well, right now, about 20% of U.S. electricity is wind, water, and solar power. And actually, I think wind overtook hydro as the #1 renewable, but it's really close between wind and hydro, and then solar is still far behind, but it is moving fast. But keep in mind, electricity is only 1/5 of all end-use energy. So we need all energy sectors to be transitioned much faster. But there are 10 countries in the world that are at 100% renewable electricity. Include Costa Rica, Norway, Tajikistan, Iceland, Albania, Paraguay, Uruguay, Bhutan, Kenya, and Scotland. And all of those are most all of those are powered mostly by hydro, although Scotland is mostly wind. Kenya is a combination of geothermal, wind, and hydro. And so those are examples of countries that, they do run on 100% renewables, or even more. Some, I think 1 or 2 of them are like 200 or 300%. They actually export all the rest of their hydroelectricity to other countries nearby. And so that's possible. But in terms of, there's a lot of growth in countries like Germany now is at 55% renewables. And China's, has installed the most renewables worldwide, but it has such a huge energy consumption that it's still a relatively small percentage of its total electricity is from renewables. There are, even in the US, though, there are examples. California is at 55% renewable electricity in the annual average, including hydro. And Idaho, sorry, not Idaho, Iowa, North Dakota, Iowa is on the order of wind alone is on the order of, I think it was like 50% wind more. But so some of these, there are states that have potential to go to 100% relatively the next 5 or 10 years. But to get the whole country, it's just going to require an order of magnitude increase. But again, we need other sectors aside from electricity to transition. To that end, more electric cars, more efficiency in buildings. And so I think Biden's recent proposal is he's actually going to dump a lot of that $2 trillion into electrification of vehicles and making buildings more energy efficient, as well as transitioning electricity. So that part's good. But yeah, there are those countries that I mentioned are all good example countries of how it can be done and how the grid stays stable. We have a lot of hydro in the US, so that helps to stabilize the grid too. I mean, hydro is basically a big battery, as I mentioned.
You mentioned batteries, and I'm just curious because I've always wondered how battery technology plays into some of this, because has the battery technology been increasing a lot so that we can store electricity in greater quantities for a longer time, and to help us to store it?
Yeah, it's getting better and better, so it's cheaper to store more electricity. And there are also different types of batteries now for stationary battery storage that don't degrade over time, like flow batteries. They don't degrade so much over time. And compared with like lithium ion, there's more degrading, but they can be used more in vehicles because there's nice density. They're very dense, and so they don't take up much space in a vehicle, where some of these other batteries take more space, so they're more appropriate for stationary storage. But technologies are getting better all the time, every week, and so the prices are coming down, and that's beneficial. I mean, I think California today just installed, I don't know if it was the first segment of what'll be the largest battery in the world that's going onto the grid, and so it was 50 megawatts storage, but it's going to be built up to 250 megawatts, and so, but we're only able to do that because prices have dropped substantially, and they're expected to keep dropping for years to come. I don't think we need like long duration battery storage so much as just we need more short duration storage to meet peaks in demand. And there are a lot, as I mentioned, a lot of the energy that we're going to need in the future. Well, when we transition everything to electricity, most of that energy will be for heating, for example. And there you can store heat for a long period of time already. You don't need electricity, even if you're using a heat pump. I mean, it's really, you need the source of the heat itself, and you can store that for a long time very inexpensively. And this has been done in Canada and Scandinavian countries for a couple decades now. So I'm not too concerned about long storage, but I think more storage is necessary, more short storage for meeting peaks. Then we can get rid of the natural gas peaker plants, because that's, natural gas peaker plants, yeah, they're used for short-term. They're really dirty, and they're short-term storage of short-term electricity production, and we can replace those with batteries. And if we do that, and also diesel generators. A lot of diesel generators that are used for emergencies that we can get rid of if we have more short-term battery storage, and that'll help clean the air as well, quite quickly.
Aisha Ahmed has a great question. She says, how much will greenhouse gas emissions actually drop with energy transition, considering emissions are continuing to rise even as renewable energy consumption is increasing right now?
Well, if we transition the world entirely to clean renewable energy, energy is responsible for about 70 to 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's responsible for about 75% of greenhouse gas emissions and about 90% of air pollutants. So if we transition all energy, we get rid of 90% of air pollutants and 70 to 75% of greenhouse gases worldwide. But to get rid of the remaining greenhouse gases, those sources of those are, for example, methane in landfills and rice paddies and cattle. So we need to clean those up through, well, in the manure too. So through the digesters, reducing beef use, beef consumption, and trapping methane more from those sources. But also halogens like CFCs. Well, CFCs were phased out, but there are other alternatives like HFCs that are still around that are global warming, have global warming potential. So those are about actually 10% of global warming is due to halogens alone. And then there's biomass burning, which is another source that can only be controlled through basically regulation, stopping the biomass burning. Mm. And then there's nitrous oxide and fertilizers. So those are the kind of main non-energy sources of greenhouse gases. And so you need separate regulation to try to control those.
So, Mark, we have a couple questions about geothermal. I think, let me just real quick. I mean, I know you've touched on it a little bit, but maybe for these folks, you can concentrate a little bit more on it. It says, you're focusing on electricity generation. We need to transition to geothermal and air source heat pumps yesterday. How do you recommend achieving widespread adoption of this technology? And then someone else said, is anyone making any headway on geothermal in the US and retrofitting or replacing existing power plants that are outdated or decommissioned?
Yeah, well, California, for example, has a law that all new homes or buildings have to be, I think it's just residential homes now, have to be zero net energy, which really requires them to have solar, no gas, and most likely using heat pumps for the heating. So I think you can regulate new homes pretty easily, just like California already has a law to do that as of this year. Existing homes retrofitting, that's also, you can legislate that as well, but people can change their own homes, as either when their gas unit fails, or if they want to be proactive right now, which they will, is to change your heating to either an air source or ground source heat pump. So by geothermal, there's two types of geothermal. There's geothermal low temperature heat, which would be mostly for use in heat pumps. And there is like if you're in New York, for example, where the temperature gets really low in the winter and not really high in the summer, you probably want a geothermal heat pump, or what's also called a ground source heat pump. And there is a company called Dandelion there, which makes these that are relatively similar cost as air source heat pumps. And they basically have a technology where they just have a vertical hole that's really narrow that goes deep down, and maybe they have two holes, but they're just really narrow. It's not, used to be you had to excavate your whole backyard, and it would be horizontal coils they put in. And that's gonna be really expensive, getting a bulldozer out there and excavating. That alone could cost $50,000 to $70,000 to do that. But now this technology, you can drill vertically very narrow holes, and it's just exchanging heat with the ground. And that's very inexpensive. The other type of geothermal is higher temperature geothermal for electricity, but there are only 13 states in the US that you can really feasibly get geothermal electricity from.
Uh-oh.
Here's a Wi-Fi shot.
Yeah.
Hopefully he'll come back.
I lost him for a minute.
Thanks everyone for hanging in there. He'll come back. There goes his electricity. He's probably got a house full of kids on the Wi-Fi. Hi, Mark.
Oh, yeah.
I lost you for a minute. You probably have a house full of kids over there on the Wi-Fi. He's on.
Yeah, occasionally so a wave of electricity comes through. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, sure.
Good.
Somebody asks, will a nuclear reactor that has zero risk of meltdown, zero risk of radiation leak, and creates no nuclear waste ever be possible? No, I don't think so, but certainly not at a competitive price. I mean, anything is theoretically possible, and this is actually what the nuclear industry banks on. They always say, well, our next technology will be better. We should invest in that and put all our money in that with the hope it'll work. And as opposed to our philosophy as well, you only want to invest in things that are basically commercial right now, or very close to commercial, because we need to solve the problem as soon as possible. We don't want to invest in things that might not, that people claim that work. I mean,
you can see the same story over and over again with biofuels as well, and carbon capture and nuclear, where every year, every few years, they're claiming they have a newer, better technology, that we should invest in that, and that should be part of the plan. But they always fizzle out, and they're never as good as they claim. Or like in the case of cellulosic ethanol, there's still really no commercial cellulosic ethanol, even though it's been pushed since 1980. And nuclear, they just keep asking for more money every year. And what do they have to show for it? There's less energy produced from nuclear worldwide this year than in 2005, 6. So it's.
Now, along those lines, just to stick with that, is that some people say we need nuclear energy for base load. Is this true?
No, it's not true at all. And in fact, nuclear energy doesn't produce reliable base load. I mean, it's down, depending on where you are. In the US, it's down like 10 to 12% of the hours of the year. So it goes down to 0. And in France, it's like, I think on the order of 30% of the hours of the year. But we don't need base load. We need to match the power demand, which is variable. Power demand goes up and down and up and down. So base load is flat. So it doesn't actually help match your power demand at all. You need a peaker plant, like a gas plant, on top of the nuclear to meet the power demand. So it's kind of hilarious that people think that baseload power doesn't require backup. It's like this assumption that if you have baseload power, you don't need like natural gas to back it up. They all say, well, you need natural gas with renewables, but no natural gas is needed with nuclear. But how is that possible? Nuclear is baseload and the demand is variable. Mm-hmm. So there's no. It's in fact, it becomes more expensive as you get more renewables on the grid. Nuclear becomes, baseload in general becomes more expensive because all this, because the renewables are variable. It's important to be careful how you match their demand. But if you have something that's inflexible, like a nuclear plant, where you can't change it, you might end up having to then shut down the wind and the solar, and so that just makes the whole system less efficient. And yeah, so it's very inefficient to have baseload power when you have high renewable penetration on the grid.
So, Mark, we have a couple questions about a documentary called Planet of the Humans. It says, before I buy an electric car, I want to know how the electricity is made. The Planet of the Humans documentary points out that large amounts of electricity are made by burning coal tied in with solar and wind power. Could you respond to that film? The other person who referenced it said, are you concerned about the collusion of corporate fossil fuel interests with corporate non-fossil fuel energy as it has been argued in the documentary Planet of the Humans?
Well, okay, so in terms of electric cars, even if your electricity for your electric car is produced by coal, it is still much better for society to use that electric car powered by coal than it is to use a gasoline car. The primary reason is regardless, well, there will be a benefit in terms of climate, but that's not actually a major reason. Its major reason is the benefit in terms of health, because what's called the intake fraction of air pollution, which is the fraction of air pollution that's emitted that you breathe in. The intake fraction of air pollution from car exhaust is about 30 times that of power plant exhaust. Because people are driving in their cars on the street, people are walking on the street, people are bike riding on the street. People are exposed to more pollution on the street than they are to power plant pollution. Not to say that power plant pollution is not clean. There's a lot of exposure and death due to power plants as well, but there's far more death from exposure to air pollution on the street. So the first thing you want to do is eliminate emissions from the street. And the way to do that is eliminate your tailpipe emissions from your car. So if you have an electric car, you have no more tailpipe emissions. That saves huge amounts of lives right away. The number of lives lost from the additional coal emissions is small compared to the number of lives saved from the reduced vehicle emissions. Now, on top of that, an electric car uses 1/4 to 1/5 the energy than a gasoline car. So basically, even though you're burning coal in that case to produce the electricity for your electric car, you're using 1/4 the energy, or to 1/5 the energy of coal than you are in the gasoline that was burned in your car. So you're not actually using a lot of coal to produce the electricity for your electric car. Now, Now, the other thing is there's hardly any coal on the grid. In the US, there's hardly any coal on the grid anymore. It's down to like 20%. It used to be 50%. But on average in the US, only 20% of the US grid is coal. So now the US grid is actually cleaner. And in some places, there's like 1 or 2% coal. Like California is like maybe at most 3% coal on the grid. But I think it's even 1 coal plant or 0 coal plants left. So you're not actually, when you actually look at real electric penetrations of coal and gas and stuff like that, there's really no case in the US that you're going to get greater greenhouse gas emissions with an electric car powered by the grid compared with a gasoline car. But regardless, from the health point of view, it's a no-brainer. And so even regardless of the climate effects, you want to do it from a health point of view. So absolutely go for an electric car. Do not listen to any people who claim that electric cars running on grid electricity cause more damage than gasoline cars. Now, the gasoline cars do cause more damage. They always will.
Just maybe, could you say that statistic again about, is it 30% more people from the tailpipe emission?
No, 30 times. It's the intake fraction of vehicle exhaust is 30, well, I'll say 25 to 30 times the intake fraction of emissions from a power plant.
Yeah. Wow.
So it's, yeah, so you're reducing if you have the same emissions from both, you have 1/30, 1/25 to 1/30 the pollution that you're breathing in. If we have clean streets, then it's a lot better for human health.
So the other person that referenced the documentary said something about collusion of corporate fossil fuel interests and corporate non-fossil fuel energy.
Well, I'm guessing they're talking about the fossil fuel industry getting into the renewable energy industry and trying to influence them.
I see.
Well, the goal is to go to entirely renewable energy. And as long as we're sticking to that goal and we're actually implementing it and putting in clean renewable energy, it doesn't matter who supports it. The fact is we need it. And so, but if they're slowing it down, then yeah, they have to be kicked out. So I can't speak. I don't remember that part of it and who they're referring to or what the situation is. So I'm just saying that we do need to move as fast as possible, and that's not a reason to slow it down just because there's a suspicion that the fossil fuel industry is investing in renewable energy as well.
There's a good question here about what would you recommend to policymakers from developing countries where people don't even have water or light, or don't have access to water and light, light at night, obviously?
Well, there's a benefit to developing countries of this transition because distributed energy, particularly solar that you can put on the rooftops or isolated, even in remote communities where there's no grid, you can create a small microgrid that can actually provide power for a community at relatively low cost. And so right now, I mean, a lot of the 7 million air pollution deaths that occur each year are in developing countries. And a lot of those deaths are due to indoor burning of biomass and coal for home heating and cooking. And so if we can go to electric heating for cooking and heat, induction cookers that run on electricity and space heaters that are even small heat pump heaters where they run on electricity, and that electricity comes from solar plus one battery or something like that. That will save huge numbers of lives, improve the quality of life, and the cost they'll save people from a lot of these people have to walk a long distance, maybe 10 miles each way to find their fuel. And so if you can collect this solar, with a panel, that can make people more productive and, in addition to saving lives. And I think you will need subsidy. Developed countries may have to contribute to that initially. Certainly developing countries should try to contribute as well and try to, for their own people. So there's not one answer, but it's definitely needed, and that's a solution so there must be a way to work between developed and developing countries to try to implement this on a larger scale, because that'll end up making developing countries more healthy and more productive, and will reduce their costs in the long term.
This is just a personal question because well, not even personal, but I have a lot of friends who like to burn wood in their fireplaces. What would you say to that?
Well, wood is like the least efficient combustion fuel there is, and also one of the most polluting. So I would get an electric fireplace that looks like wood. Actually, they do have. Actually, if you look in the textbook, I have a photograph of a electric fireplace that looks amazingly like a real fireplace. So
That's funny. And what do you think about Project Drawdown? There's a lot of environmentalists are using that as a model for sort of the future.
well, I think every effort to improve or reduce energy consumption and to solve this problem is helpful. And they have a different approach, let's say, than I do. I think they're offering like a lot of, maybe, I don't know, it was 100 different techniques to reduce emissions. I think one of the main differences, we've gone country by country and quantified what is needed in each country, and then proposed one set of solutions for that country that relates primarily to energy, which is, as I mentioned, 75% of all the greenhouse gas emissions and 90% of the air pollutants. So we're focused on kind of a real focus on solution. I think the danger of having like 100 different options is it's hard to determine what's the best option, most effective, or what's the numbers for each option and how many we need. So, but I think it's a good idea to have lots of information, lots of possibilities, lots of information that people can consider and also get better ideas from. I think these plans that we've developed, I think they're practical in order for, at least they're a specific goal that countries can shoot for and also states can shoot for. And so I think there is a benefit of that as well.
So if people want to get their hands on your plans and advocate for this and go to their politicians and say, this is what we should be working on, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, all our plans, the actual published papers are at a website. I think I sent you, maybe you can make public, but also the solutionsproject.org, there's a link to an infographic map of the world. And also there's a link for the US states and cities in these states. And you can click on a country or state or city and up will pop a summary of a plan. And also there's at the bottom, there's the same reference to the papers as well. Okay. So it's really the raw papers that have most of the information. And then we have some summary sheets for different countries as well. That are at this one website on my Stanford website. And so I think that's the best place. And also, well, and the textbook will have a summary also of the country plans in particular for the 143 countries that we just completed.
So if you were talking to a young person today, I think of a lot of the climate activists many of whom are teenagers, and I'm sure they're thinking about, what professions to go into and what ways they can be effective leaders. What are some avenues that you would direct them to?
Well, yeah, I mean, I found many young people are very passionate about this. And so certainly learning about it through their high school and college educations, I think, going and directing a major, that would be one thing. I mean, I think it's really critical for people who really want to make a difference in the long run. If you're young and you have that ability to, and you have a chance to go to school and learn more about it, is to focus your education around this topic. And because that will give you the most insight and expertise and credibility as well when you get out. Now, if you're past that point where you can spend time going to school, certainly there are lots of nonprofits. There are startup companies that are, well, usually startups will work on one technology, but there are a lot of individual technologies that people either like or find fascinating or will find beneficial. And also going to government service is another public service. Utilities do need help. There are a lot of companies that need experts because I mentioned there are 250 odd companies that have committed to 100% renewables, but they don't necessarily know how to do it. So they need experts on this. So this again speaks to why it's good to get some educational background.
And that would be, would you say in engineering specifically, or what would you say, like literally, you know, what majors to go into to work on this?
Well, I think majors are very fluid. And so I wouldn't just say engineering, although certainly are engineering programs that have, but every university is different.
Okay.
So there are environmental science, it could be even economics or business, or some programs in energy. But yeah, it's kind of a mixture. I mean, it's a mixture of science, engineering, policy, and economics.
Right.
And so every university, as I mentioned, is different. Sometimes there are faculty members in departments that have nothing to do with renewable energy, so they're hidden away. So yeah, I don't want to just stereotype it, but I would say just look for the subject matter, look for the courses, and see where they fit together into a program.
Great, great.
So Heidi, should we just, we only have a couple questions left up here. Maybe we want to make sure we get them anyway.
Well, I think that we've kind of answered a lot of it, but
That's what I thought. But
yeah, I think we've answered them. Do you have any final words for us, Mark, that you would like to share with our audience?
Well, I just want to say to stay optimistic. I mean, I'm very optimistic that we can solve the problem because I've seen the numbers and I feel it's possible. But it's also important to have a positive attitude going into this, and because it is such a the consequences are so dire that we need to stay positive but also not only believe it, but just you can see examples of this working in many places at small scales. In some places, some sectors are working at large scales, and you can see technologies improving every day in transportation, in buildings, and industry. For example, they're now producing steel at a factory with hydrogen instead of using fossil fuels. And so there is reason to be optimistic, but also keep focused, keep your eye on the ball. Don't get distracted by the proposed technologies that might be available in a decade or even 5 years from now. I would say, focus on things that we know work today and things we know are clean and they're not complicated. And so because those things have proven to work and they basically just need to be implemented on a much larger scale. So stay positive, stay focused, and don't let negativity get you down, because that's very easy in this day and age, but it's very easy to be distracted or to feel like people are against you, but just stay focused and believe in what you believe is true and correct, and stick to that. And I think if we do that on a large scale, we'll be fine in the end.
Thank you. That's really great. And I would like just to add a couple of words, which is there are so many wonderful NGOs out there that are working hard on these issues. And that's one good way to get involved for people who want to. They're already they're in the path. They've got, strategy set up. They're already, it's hard sometimes to start in the middle of how do I do this? But you can join others who are effectively working. And that's a great way to get started.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mark and Dennis and Heidi. And thank you all for joining us and for your awesome questions. This was live streamed and we will send out the webinar tape to you like the last time. And I'm going to just hand it over to Dennis to tell us a little bit about next week and what you can expect next Tuesday.
Yes, well, we're very excited to have a friend of mine here to speak with us. His name is Jacobson Ghost Horse. Jacobson is from South Dakota originally. He's a member of the Cheyenne River Lakota Nation. And he's an international speaker. He travels all over the world, as that defines, on peace, indigenous perspective, and the perspective from a Mother Earth perspective, he calls it. And I just think that it's gonna be wonderful after we've had our first two guests speaking about solutions and climate change. And I think it's gonna be great to get the Jacobson's perspective. He's a host and executive producer for 24 years of his own radio show called First Voices Radio, and it's just it's been syndicated to 70 radio stations all over the U.S. and Canada. So he's a person who's working really, really hard to get his voice out there and his message, and I think we're really looking forward to having him here next week.
Yes, and thank you again, Mark. That was incredible.
Yes, thank you, Mark.
Thanks for having me on, everybody.
Thank you. Be safe, everyone.
Yes, you
Thank
too.
you,
Thank you.
everyone.
There.